Hello, beautiful community. Very welcome to this video, in which, in an informal way, I'm going to try to have a go at a question that many of you have asked, which is why hasn't Putin fired Shoigu? So let's put away the kind of frivolous answer, which says it's because he's too weak to do that. Because that doesn't really explain anything. Well, weak in what way and why, and what does that mean for what's going to happen next? So let's put ourselves a little bit against a sort of canvas of context to warm up for this question, and then we'll say a little bit about the question directly. So I think there are a couple of videos on the main channel that are pre-war, where I talk about a certain kind of image, and that's the image of the Putin regime as a boat that's called Putin, with Putin on board in the captain's uniform, but without all of the powers of the captain. You would have heard that image from me. Then I've often used another image, which is to describe the regime as a kind of a blend between the board of a corporation and a mafia organization, with various figures around Putin, but their roles being perhaps rather fluid, with one thing differentiating them perhaps being a scale of significance of each actor, rather than a kind of a portfolio of responsibility. So there's a kind of a sort of mafia diffused board of a corporation. And the point of these images and various other images we may have invoked is to make clear that before the war, the verticality of Putin's regime was overestimated. You see, it's only now that, of course, when Putin engaged in his brutal invasion of Ukraine, people are so outraged with it that they're saying, all Russians are responsible for it, which is correct. People are going further. They're saying all Russians are guilty for it. And then people are going further than that and saying Russian culture has simply produced this. And we're going to have conversations analyzing how far such claims are sustainable and how far they're a product of genuine analysis versus just expressive political discourse. But the point is that actually before the war, the verticality of Putin's regime was overestimated in the Western press. And I can tell you, because I haven't been in this game just since the war began. I've been in this game in a certain sense since the 1990s. A lot of the people who are saying it's all the whole culture, it's the whole thing, were dramatically overestimating the verticality of the Putin regime. Somebody who's done a lot of highly respected work on Russia, including books. I'm not going to name names, but I remember sitting in a tent, listening to them speak at a festival, the journalism festival, and they were giving a completely top-down picture of the Putin regime without the question being properly put on the table. How far is Putin has been Russia a top-down story, and how far is it a bottom-up story? That's a question you always have to ask when you're trying to negotiate different modes of explanation, which might be applicable for explaining what's transpired. And so very funnily, all of these people who are sort of horizontalizing it in an intellectually sloppy way, an excessive way now, were in an intellectually sloppy and excessive way verticalizing it now. Then it sounded like Mr. Putin had taken the whole country hostage, and that was all there was to it, if you listen to some of that discourse. So there was this overestimation of Putin's verticality, and a corrective image that comes out of some of these visual metaphors I've conjured might be that Putin was less leading and more refereeing inter-elite and intra-elite conflicts. And in a certain sense, that's what the Prigozhin story was. It was a controllable story that was getting out of control. It was of functional benefit to Mr. Putin for Prigozhin to attack the Ministry of Defense and to attack Shoigu very personally and Gerasimov as strongly but with less visceral language. So that background of Putin more as referee than vertical dictator is how we come into the war. And of course, the late Gleb Pavlovsky plausibly argued that Putin's increasingly referee-like role, this role of sort of outsourcing the powers of the presidency to various people around him, seeing them act out, seeing them conflict, and then coming in to mediate these conflicts, that role was putting Putin in an increasingly weakened position. That he was both doing more of the refereeing work rather than the vertical staff, and as referee he was becoming a little weaker. And that was part of why the war started, Gleb Pavlovsky argued. Now, that very much, we're not going to analyze that right now, but that very much at least points us in the direction of the analysis that the people who know more about Russia go in for, which is to emphasize the place of regime security in the motivation for the war. And to acknowledge, but not make exclusive and to some extent relegate the role of national security as a cause of the war. Of course, it's both. And part of the reason it's so obviously also about national security is that Putin has certain mystical ideas about national security, right? They are less instrumental and less perfunctory than we might think, but they're there, right? So it's both. But there was this big regime security story that we might be wise to start with when we explain the causes of the war. So that's how we come in, right? And when you transpose this business of Putin as referee onto the intense context of a failing war, right? The whole thing begins to crackle, if not crack. So now that we've created this little bit of canvas for us, let's say a little bit more. We can be very confident that if you removed Mr. Prigozhin, or if Mr. Prigozhin had a magical conversion and fell in love with Mr. Shoigu, and tomorrow started saying how Mr. Shoigu is the best thing since sliced bread, the pressure for Putin to remove Shoigu wouldn't go away. And that's to say, Putin is experiencing pressure from some people around him that's about the idea that the Shoigu and Gerasimov situation is not working out very well, right? So Prigozhin was an expression of a pool that is present in the elites, in the very high up elites, very small number of people behind the scenes, and that pool burst out into public life in the most spectacular and farcical and indeed existential way for the regime. So that pressure to do something about Shoigu and Gerasimov is there, and it's independent of Mr. Prigozhin. It's independent of Mr. Popov, a figure in the army who came out with a quite political statement recently. Now, a statement of protest against the leadership of the army. So that's one thing we can say. Now let's imagine what would happen if Putin removed Shoigu and Gerasimov tomorrow. Now, this would create a very significant risk for the army. we've already discussed in our morale crisis in the Russian army video on the main channel that however stuck or not stuck Ukraine's counteroffensive might be, there is this possibility that on the basis of what we know, we perhaps can't rule out of some kind of a major collapse of the Russian military, mediated by morale, mediated by soldiers not understanding why they're there, who they're fighting for, why the people they're fighting for are fighting among themselves, and so on and so forth. So it's a very risky predicament. And then imagine if Putin gets rid of Shoigu and Gerasimov and things at the front get worse or get dramatically worse. Right? That's a much worse position for Putin than things getting dramatically worse with Shoigu and Gerasimov. Because at that stage he could at least look at perhaps doing something about further demoting them informally or indeed formally moving them on. So this is not an easy situation for him. His hope is probably to keep things as they are and try to hang on through a frozen conflict for months and maybe a year and maybe more than just a year. Right? But we're going to keep on commenting on how that's going for him, because undoubtedly what the Prigozhin mutiny made palpable is the weakness of the Putin regime, which in making it palpable, the mutiny itself exaggerated further, because it irreversibly did damage to that aura that Putin has of being the only political institution in the country with perceived legitimacy. So what we want to say is that it's obvious that moving Shoigu and Gerasimov on for Putin is an extremely dangerous move. And that it might be the case that it's not just people around him who are convinced that that should be done, that are questioning this. It might be that there's a couple of people divided about this, and Putin himself is divided about this. But he knows that he is in a bit of a lose-lose situation. Keeping them is difficult. Getting rid of them is difficult. So we can expect Putin to try to muddle through until he reaches, or unless he reaches a point where something very critical happens and he needs to start rejigging the situation, because he can no longer control these elite conflicts around him, and they are pushing him into doing something more dramatic about the Shoigu and Gerasimov situation. So that's general and it's speculative, but that's, I think, the beginning of a conversation that might give us a sense of where the answer to the question, why isn't he getting rid of Shoigu, goes. Lots of love and thank you for being with me. Talk very soon.